My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I was the daughter who tried harder and got noticed less. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because I think you need to understand just how deep this went before I can tell you what happened the day we opened my mother's will. I grew up in a small house on Maple Ridge Drive, the kind of house with a crooked mailbox and a porch swing that squeaked no matter how much oil my father put on the hinges. My sister Vanessa was born when I was 2 years old. I don't remember a time before her. I only remember a time when the entire house seemed to orbit around her. When we were kids, my mother would spend hours brushing Vanessa's hair into perfect curls before school, tying ribbons that matched her outfits down to the shade. My hair, meanwhile, was usually thrown into a ponytail by my own 8-year-old hands because my mother was busy with your sister. I told myself that was normal. Little sisters need more help, right? Older sisters are supposed to be independent. I built that story in my head because the alternative, that I simply mattered less, was too painful to hold. But little moments kept chipping away at that story. I remember being 9 years old, standing in the kitchen with a spelling test in my hand. I'd gotten 100%, every word. I ran through the house looking for my mother, found her in the living room, brushing Vanessa's hair again, this time for a dance recital that was still 2 days away. "Mom, look," I said, holding up the paper. She glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. "That's great, honey. Can you go get Vanessa's tights from the dryer?" I remember standing there a beat too long, waiting for something more. It never came. I got the tights. That night at dinner, my father asked Vanessa about her dance moves. He asked her 3 separate questions about the recital. He didn't ask me anything about school at all. When I mentioned my test on my own, unprompted, he said, "Good job, Claire," without lifting his eyes from his plate. I was 9. I didn't have the words for what I was feeling. I just knew that something inside my chest went quiet that night, and it stayed quiet for a very long time. Part 2. Growing up in the shadow. As we got older, the pattern didn't change. It deepened. When Vanessa struggled in math, my parents hired a private tutor twice a week, no questions asked. When I asked if I could join the debate team, which required a small participation fee, my mother sighed and said money was tight that month. I got a part-time job at the local pharmacy instead, at 15 years old, folding sweaters and restocking shampoo bottles so I could pay for it myself. When Vanessa got caught skipping school in 10th grade, my mother cried on the phone with the principal, blaming the pressure she's under. And Vanessa got off with a warning. When I was 15 minutes late to class because the bus broke down, my father lectured me for 20 minutes about responsibility. I used to sit in my room after those nights and ask myself, over and over, what did I do wrong? Was I too quiet? Too serious? Did I remind them of some part of themselves they didn't like? I turned the question over so many times it wore a groove into me, like a record played too many times on the same track. There was one night I've never forgotten. I was 16. Vanessa had thrown a party while our parents were out of town, a party I wasn't invited to, in my own house, with people I didn't know drinking out of cups on our kitchen counter. When our parents came home early and found the mess, I expected Vanessa to be grounded for a month. Instead, my mother sat on the edge of Vanessa's bed that night, stroking her hair, saying, "It's okay, baby, everybody makes mistakes. You're still figuring things out." I was in the hallway. I heard every word. And I remember thinking, if I had thrown that party, I would have lost my phone, my car privileges, and probably my sense of safety in this house for a month. But Vanessa got a bedtime story and forgiveness before the sun even came up. I didn't say anything. I never said anything. I just got quieter and quieter and quieter until quiet became who I was. Part 3. Building a life alone. When I got into a state university on a partial scholarship, my parents didn't come to my graduation. They said the drive was too far, 3 hours, the same distance they'd happily driven twice a month to watch Vanessa's dance competitions. I stood in that auditorium in my cap and gown, scanning the crowd for faces that weren't there, while the girl next to me hugged her parents so tightly I had to look away. When Vanessa dropped out of community college after one semester, my parents threw her a party. A real party, with a cake that said "New Beginnings" in pink frosting. My mother refilled Vanessa's champagne glass 3 times that night while I stood in the corner holding a soda I never asked for and didn't want. I built a life in spite of all of it. I got a job at a marketing firm 2 states away, far enough that I could breathe, close enough that I still came home every holiday. I worked my way up over the years. I bought a small condo on my own. I built friendships, a quiet, stable life, a version of myself I was proud of, even if no one back home seemed to notice. For 15 years, I called every Sunday, without fail. I drove 2 hours each way for every holiday, every birthday, every 4th of July barbecue. I remembered my mother's blood pressure medication schedule better than she did. I remembered my father's cardiologist appointments and called to remind him the morning of every single time. Vanessa showed up when it was convenient. Sometimes she didn't show up at all. She missed my father's 60th birthday because of a work thing that, as far as I could tell, never actually existed. And still, my mother defended her. "You know how busy she is, Claire. Not everyone has your discipline." That word, discipline, used to feel like a compliment. Over the years, it started to feel like a diagnosis. Like something was wrong with me for simply being reliable, for simply showing up, for simply loving my family the only way I knew how. I stopped asking why around my 30th birthday because the question had worn a hole straight through me and I needed it to stop hurting. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I told myself a lot of things over the years, actually. Most of them weren't true, but they got me through. Part 4, the phone call. 6 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in March, my phone rang while I was in a client meeting. It was my mother's number, but it was Vanessa's voice on the other end, cracking, barely able to form words. "Claire, it's Dad. You need to come home, now." My father had suffered a massive heart attack in the garage, working on the old truck he never quite finished restoring. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing anyone could do. I don't remember most of the drive home. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I remember arriving at the hospital and seeing my mother sitting alone in a plastic chair in the hallway, staring at nothing, and how small she suddenly looked. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolence cards, and people saying, "He's in a better place now," as if that made the silence in the house any less deafening. My mother was never the same after that. The doctors called it a decline, grief compounding on top of her existing health issues. 4 months later, almost to the day, she passed away in her sleep. The doctor said her heart simply gave out. I think grief just finally caught up to a body that had been tired for years, carrying weight none of us fully understood. I flew home for the second funeral in less than half a year, feeling like I'd aged a decade in 6 months. Part 5, the will. 2 weeks after my mother's funeral, Vanessa and I sat across from each other in the office of Mr. Halloway, our parents' longtime attorney, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had drafted my parents' wills, their home purchase paperwork, and even my father's small business contracts decades earlier. He'd known our family longer than either of us had been alive. Vanessa sat across the table, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue she didn't seem to need, already mentioning a real estate agent friend of hers who could get us top dollar for the house. I said nothing. I was too tired to argue, too hollowed out by 2 funerals to care about real estate values. Mr. Halloway cleared his throat and opened a manila folder resting on the desk between us. "Before I read the will," he said, his voice careful, almost hesitant, "your mother asked me to give you both something first." He slid 2 envelopes across the polished wood. Mine was noticeably thicker than Vanessa's. I felt my stomach tighten before I even touched it. I opened mine with shaking hands. Inside was a letter in my mother's unmistakable looping handwriting, along with a stack of old photographs, hospital records, and documents I had never seen before in my life. The letter began, "Claire, my love, I owe you an apology I should have given you 30 years ago." I had to stop and breathe before I could keep reading. Across from me, Vanessa had gone very still, watching my face. Part 6. The Truth. My mother's letter explained everything. 30 years of silence, unpacked in 11 handwritten pages. When Vanessa was 2 years old, doctors discovered a serious heart condition, a congenital defect that at the time came with a frightening prognosis. The specialists told my parents that Vanessa might not survive childhood. There were surgeries. There were nights in hospital waiting rooms I never knew about because I was only 4 years old myself, staying with a neighbor while my parents sat vigil over my baby sister's hospital bed. My mother wrote that in that terror, she and my father made a decision they never told me about, and honestly, never fully admitted to themselves. They decided to give Vanessa everything, every indulgence, every leniency, every ounce of attention they had, because they were living every single day with the fear that it might be her last. They didn't discipline her the way they disciplined me, because they couldn't bear the thought of a hard word being among her final memories. They celebrated her smallest achievements like miracles, because to them, every year she lived past that early diagnosis felt like one. And in the process, without ever meaning to, they stopped seeing me. Not because they loved me less, because they were so consumed by the fear of losing one daughter that they leaned on the strength of the other without ever once acknowledging what that strength was costing her. You were the strong one, my mother wrote, so we leaned on you without ever telling you we were leaning. We told ourselves you didn't need us the way she did. We told ourselves you understood. We were wrong, Claire. You needed us just as much as she did, maybe more, because you were carrying an invisible weight nobody ever thanked you for carrying. I am so sorry. I am sorry for every recital I chose over your spelling test. I am sorry for every party we threw for her and never threw for you. I am sorry it took me, until my last months on this earth, to write these words down. She went on to explain that Vanessa's heart condition, while it had stabilized in adulthood, still required ongoing monitoring and expensive medication that insurance never fully covered. That was why the will was structured the way it was. This is why the house, the savings, and your father's pension are left to you. Not because we loved you more in the end. We didn't. We loved you unfairly for 30 years, in the opposite direction, and I cannot undo that. This is the only way I know how to try to make it right, to finally give you what we withheld for so long, and to make sure your sister's health is protected the way it always quietly needed to be, without you having to sacrifice anything more for it. I looked up. My hands were trembling. Part 7. Vanessa's envelope. Vanessa's face had gone pale as she watched me read. Her own envelope, thinner, sat unopened in her lap. "What does it say?" she asked quietly. I couldn't speak yet. I just slid the letter across the table to her. Vanessa read it in silence, her eyes moving faster and faster down the page, her breathing growing shallow. When she finished, she opened her own envelope with hands that shook even more than mine had. Inside was a much shorter note, an apology of a different kind, gentler, aimed at a daughter my mother had spent a lifetime protecting rather than raising. Along with it was the deed to a small condo, already paid off in full, and paperwork establishing a lifetime medical trust to cover her ongoing cardiac care. For a long moment, neither of us said a single word. Mr. Halloway quietly excused himself from the room, sensing, correctly, that this was no longer a meeting he needed to preside over. Vanessa broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know," she said. "Claire, I swear to you I didn't know any of this. I didn't know I was sick like that. I didn't know why they were always like that with me. I always just thought." She stopped, pressing the tissue to her eyes, this time because she actually needed it. "I always thought you just didn't need them, that you were the strong one and I was the weak one, and that was just how it was supposed to be." And I believed her. In that moment, sitting in that quiet office with the afternoon light slanting through the blinds, I finally saw my sister, not as the golden child who got everything, but as a scared little girl who had grown up being told, without words, that her life was fragile and needed constant celebrating. That her existence itself was something to be protected, walked on eggshells around, treated as temporary. None of that had been her choice either. None of it had been her fault. Part 8. What we carried. We sat in that office and cried together for the first time in probably 15 years. Not because of the money, the house, the trust. None of that mattered in that moment. We cried because, For the first time in our entire lives, the silence between us finally made sense. 30 years of unexplained favoritism, of unspoken resentment, of a wound I didn't even have language for until I was in my 30s. It all clicked into place at once, painful and clarifying in the same breath. I used to lie awake, I told her, my voice cracking, wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why I wasn't enough. I used to lie awake, she said, wondering why I felt like I was drowning in love I didn't deserve. Like I was faking being okay because everyone needed me to be the miracle kid who made it. I never got to just be a normal kid who messed up sometimes. Every mistake I made, they'd get this look on their faces like they were terrified it meant something worse. I never understood why until right now. We talked for hours that afternoon, longer than we had talked in years combined. We pieced together memories from opposite sides of the same house, moments I'd interpreted as favoritism that she'd experienced as suffocating fear disguised as love. It didn't erase the years. It didn't hand back the birthdays my parents missed or the ones they showed up to only for her. But it gave us both something we'd never had before, a shared understanding of what actually happened, instead of two separate, lonely versions of the same painful story. Part 9. Moving forward. In the months since, Vanessa and I have started rebuilding something. It's slow. It's careful. There are still moments where old resentment flickers up in me unexpectedly, watching her casually mention a doctor's appointment she doesn't stress over the way I would have, catching myself keeping score out of 30 years of habit. I don't think that fully goes away. I don't think it's supposed to. But I no longer carry the question that used to keep me up at night, turning over and over like a stone I couldn't put down. I finally know why. I know it wasn't because I was unlovable or forgettable or somehow less deserving of my parents' attention. I know it was fear, misdirected, poorly handled, deeply human fear, that shaped 30 years of our family in ways none of us chose and none of us fully understood until it was too late to fix it while they were still alive. I sold my share of the house eventually. I couldn't live in it, not with all those echoes in every room. But I kept one thing, the porch swing, the one with the hinges that always squeaked no matter how much oil my father used. I had it shipped to my condo, and some evenings I sit on it and just let it creak, and I think about a family that loved imperfectly, but in the end tried, too late but still tried, to make things right. I don't know if Vanessa and I will ever be close the way sisters in movies are. There are too many years, too much distance, too many Sundays I called alone, and too many recitals she got and I didn't. But we call each other now, not out of obligation, out of something that finally feels a little more honest. Sometimes the people who love us make choices out of fear that look, from the outside, like favoritism. It doesn't undo the years of hurt. It doesn't hand back a childhood spent wondering what you did wrong. But understanding, when it finally comes, even 30 years late, even in an 11-page letter you're only allowed to read after someone is gone, it does let you finally put the question down. And for the first time in my life, I've stopped carrying it. If this story meant something to you, you're not alone. So many of us grew up wondering why love in our family felt uneven without ever knowing the full story behind it. Family isn't always fair, but understanding, even when it comes late, is where healing starts. If you've lived something like this, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe.